MMT is a departure in that you have an opening to empirical reality, which is closed in neoclassical economics. Real instruments in government that affect the economy do different things, and the deficit isn't a deficiency. It doesn't need to be plugged up later by a currency issuing government. This is government adding liquidity. It's a signifier. You can produce as many signifiers as you want. You can produce as many digits as you want. The more or less of them doesn't deplete the stock. Everyone has their own folk economics. The subjectivity of government leaders is important, but it's at the same time, there's a reality that they can't deny.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley, and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, policy analyst and consultant on green building and renewable energy, and research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Dr. Michael Hoexter. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to him about framing the debate around funding the urgent transformation needed to save the planet we all depend on. If you're new to MMT, the jumping off point is that currency issuing governments such as those of the UK, the US, Japan, Canada and Australia can't run out of their own money. And for newer listeners, I've linked to our episodes about how governments spend in the show notes for this episode. But no sooner does this reality become incontestable than politicians and pundits start lecturing everybody about the dangers of inflation. And that's where orthodox economics takes center stage. And the great thing about that is no one has to worry about complex geopolitical reality or consider that maybe disrupting the world's food and fuel supplies with war and sanctions has made food and fuel more expensive, and that's made everything else expensive. And by the way, burning that fuel was already costing us the earth, literally. And so maybe in the name of humanity, we could implement a Green New Deal, seeing as how we know where to find the money now. But with orthodox thinking, you can push all of that to one side and blame low interest rates for anything and everything, while everyone else who's not an economist can see that trying to lower prices by raising prices, like interest rates, is like trying to put out a fire with a bazooka. So in the show notes, I've linked to our episodes about inflation and the job guarantee, which is the MMT policy for providing superior price stability compared to the way we do it now. And just before we dive in, as I mentioned last week, Modern Money Lab in Australia have launched a suite of graduate and postgraduate courses in modern monetary theory and ecological economics that can be accessed from just about anywhere in the world online. And the organizers are hosting live Q&A events for people interested in enrolling. So I've linked to where you can find out more about those events in the show notes for this episode, where, as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we're joined today by policy analyst and consultant on green building, climate and renewable energy, and research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Dr. Michael Hoexter. Thanks so much for joining us today, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Christian and Patricia.
So, because it's our first time talking, we'd love to know the origin story. Could you tell us how you first came to an MMT understanding of the economy? Was it just how you learned economics at school, or was there a light bulb moment later on?
It's really something I came upon when I started to wrestle with the climate issue in about 2015 or so. I always considered myself a green person and also was a left green person since I came of age, so to speak, a late teenager. I studied psychology. That's where my PhD comes from. But then I realized I had repressed or suppressed the climate crisis from my general understanding of the world. And it came to me in about 2006 or so that it really was something I needed to devote myself to. And so some of my work has certainly been involved in energy efficiency and renewable energy. But then also I have so many intellectual interests and a background in social science. So I started to look more at the policy instruments that were being proposed to deal with our climate issue. The discussion in the 2000s was about basically the difference between a carbon tax and cap and trade, which was within the universe of market-based instruments. And I came to favor the carbon tax policy instrument, but I just realized that I needed to understand better the economics, how to evaluate policy instruments that are supposed to essentially save us from annihilation as a species. And I came to understand that they were both certainly a partial vision of what can be done within the economy and within public policy. And then also I came on to the formulation of what I call climate Keynesianism in about 2008. Also, I had formulated the idea of something called a renewable electron economy, switching over to electricity as the energy carrier. Back then, it wasn't so obvious how people were going to use energy in terms of the actual technologies and so forth and so on. In terms of economics, I came to focus more on what I called climate Keynesianism and realized that governments had done some effective climate policy without calling it climate policy. For instance, France, when they had switched over to nuclear power, and the German government, when it instituted what's called a feed-in tariff for solar energy. So I realized that it was government saying, we're going to change our energy system and doing some public policy initiative that wasn't necessarily a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, where actually emissions were cut, or at least the tools were created with which emissions could be cut from our society, and we could get energy still from those technologies. I was dissatisfied, though, and I wanted to learn more. Steve Keen had some great materials that he was producing, and he's a post-Keynesian, and he is close to MMT. And I was working through his economic models and his understanding of the economy and his debt deflation model of Great Depressions, or the one that he adopted from Irving Fisher. But I was also unhappy with his focus on private debt, and I thought something was missing out of his picture. And I realized that MMT was supplying that missing piece. And I got in touch with Stephanie Kelton, and she said that, she was interested in having someone at New Economic Perspectives to blog about climate issues. And so that's how I started to become a part of the MMT community and produce the blog posts that you see at New Economic Perspectives. The public policy component is something that MMT is very focused on, and the fiscal policy component. And that seemed to be the big missing ingredient. I consider myself to be a general social scientist, and I think that psychology is an important component of any economic model, because I call it the first and last mile of any action in the economy. It goes through people's minds in some form or another. So people are not robots. Our minds mediate both the information we receive and then also the output of our actions. So it's a missing link in some models, certainly, of how the economy works.
You mentioned you came in from psychology, and in mainstream economics, the thing that underpins everything is the idea of human beings as utility maximizing. But when mainstream economists are challenged on it, they usually say it's probably not completely right, but it's a good enough approximation and good enough for what we need to model. I was wondering whether you had any views on that. Is it a good enough approximation?
I think that mainstream economists have an atomistic view of people and of society. So yes, if you atomize individuals, or if you try to focus on each individual in isolation, it can be a pretty good approximation. But if you look at the whole composite of our society, which includes the government, among other things, and government policy, detaching the government from the economy doesn't make any sense. I talk a lot about ethics, among other things, that the ethical orientation of government leaders and also the social contract between people and the government leadership creates all kinds of different other realities in the economy itself. Social policy, Clement Attlee creating the NHS. Was that utility maximizing behavior on the part of whom? Other changes in the way systems are built in society come from a combination of, yes, self-interest and utility maximization, but also, you could say, not purely altruistic, but impulses to be part of a group and group orientation of people. They do things that don't maximize their individual utilities. We see this in the pandemic. We see people doing perversely the wrong thing, like not getting vaccinated because they have an allegiance to a political ideology that tells them that they're fighting their hated enemy by not getting vaccinated. That isn't utility maximization. So it falls down as a description of actual real behavior. But if you cut up society into little pieces and you focus on if the price of milk is, lower here than it is there, more people will buy the milk over there. It's okay. Then you can say that is homo economicus. But that view doesn't encompass a lot of the important aspects of our society, especially how it changes over time, its dynamics.
Is what you're saying that there is a very strong social dimension to human behavior, that the utility maximizing assumption at individual level falls apart because of that?
Yes, we're social animals, and the utility maximization is about an individualized isolate. The biologists that I prefer talk about group selection and not just individual selection. So it even gets to the level of Darwin. In other words, that groups or species or whatever are selected for by evolution, not just individual advantages. Humans are social animals, incontrovertibly, but economists generally haven't caught up with that.
So turning the corner into MMT, I think a great place to start in terms of your writing would be a piece you wrote called Deficit is the Wrong Word and Concept, because that really goes to an important part of what MMT is for newer listeners, but it also goes to your views about communicating MMT. Could you tell us about that piece?
Sure. The use of the word deficit, I found, was a holdover from what we would call conventional neoclassical economics that don't have a good theory of money, especially fiat money, and also macroeconomically ignorant economics, not necessarily purely MMT economics. And so the idea of a deficit, the image evokes a hole, a lack, a deficiency. When it isn't a deficiency, it doesn't need to be plugged up later by a currency issuing or, monetarily sovereign government. Also, it creates this plenitude of action in the economy and also income and savings in the private sector. So the word I came up with is net contribution. So I think net contribution is better as a way to describe, is more accurate. The critics of MMT would say, no, you're just fluffing, doing PR for deficits. So they appear to be better than they quote unquote really are. But no, I think it's a more accurate description of this is government adding liquidity. I also like to use the word liquidity as a general term to describe the money credit continuum that drives economic behavior. So it's a net contribution of liquidity to the private sector or the economy overall by government, while taxes are a withdrawal of that liquidity. I feel like MMT economists are caught between respectability politics of using the word deficit because it's what other economists use and what commentators use, and actually describing what a deficit is, which is a net contribution. So my preference would be that people say this is a deficit or so-called deficit spending or a net contribution by government. And eventually, I would hope that the MMT view would prevail, because otherwise we're playing with the wrong framing. It's really about communication. You say a word and there's also a frame around the word, and the word deficit has the wrong frame.
Is that probably the reason why a lot of MMT economists do blogs rather than papers? Because they feel that otherwise they're pressured into using a very specific framing or a language?
No, I think that's because economic journals are scholastic endeavors, meaning that they're associated with a school. Anyone coming from an MMT perspective, no matter the terminology they're using, they wouldn't necessarily be accepted. It would be like throwing something against the wall to see if it would stick if they were submitting papers to a conventional journal. My perception of the hierarchy of journals and so forth and so on is that all post-Keynesianism is considered to be beyond the pale. Now, there could be breakthroughs, and certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly raised the profile of MMT. So I hope what I just said is no longer true.
I think the concern you had then about the word deficit, a lot of people still talk about this now online. Why do you guys say deficit? We know that the government's deficit is the non-government's surplus. They're the same thing. Why not use the second term rather than the first one? Because the second one's positive. And I think once we've got people at that point where they're complaining about it, then we're where we want people to be. So they understand that a deficit is a representation of a surplus. In reverse, it's the mirror image of a surplus. And then you get to go, okay, so who's got the surplus that's implied by a government deficit? Think it through. And I think that's why Stephanie's work has the tone that it has and why she called her book The Deficit Myth. Just trying to go, okay, I'm going to go headlong into that charge. You know what I mean?
No, I understand with her book, obviously she needs to take on the word deficit. She couldn't call it net contribution. No one would know what she was talking about.
Yeah, you got to meet people where they are type thing.
But I would always be reframing it as a fullness and not creating a hole. Even if you say, as you said, if it's a surplus for the private sector, you're still saying government is still in the hole. No, it's not. So that's where I say net contribution. So it gets out of the world of having a substance metaphysics, it's called, where you basically say this is a substance that you have to conserve. So you have to conserve the substance. No, in this case, it's a signifier. It's literally, you can produce as many signifiers as you want. You can produce as many digits as you want. The more or less of them doesn't really draw out or deplete the stock of them. Again, someone else could come up with a better formulation. That's the one I came up with 10 years ago.
I think it has stuck because a lot of the time we will talk about net financial assets. Also, Bill Mitchell, last time he was in London doing a sort of training the trainers thing, he was talking about, we should say, injections and leakages.
Yeah, that's a similar approach.
We also have an issue with the word debt. We're always very unhappy with saying that the government is in debt to somebody.
I think that's always a great case for, as many MMTers have written, we should just stop issuing debt then, shouldn't we? It's a monetary policy operation. It's not really needed. All it's really doing is costing a lot of political capital.
Right. Certainly, it does become a handhold for the Austerians to problematize government spending. Absolutely. You could categorize debt in different ways. You could say there's private debt and then there's sovereign debt in its own currency is not necessary for the sovereign to spend money.
The way I finally became cognizant of what government bonds were, which is a savings account at the central bank, moving your non-interest bearing pounds and turning them into interest bearing pounds. So they're still assets the non-government sector can hold. It is a tricky one to communicate, and we've done whole episodes on it. And I think that's why Stephanie Kelton wrote a book and we do a podcast rather than trying to get this into 240 character tweets. It needs laying out in paragraphs rather than sound bites. The internet is a micro medium. We don't have to craft one message for everybody because we've bought an ad at the Super Bowl halftime show.
I think, though, it helps to contest the communicative frame and say the frame of deficits is wrong. We need to reframe it. And it's not just marketing. In this case, is actually getting at what the actual reality is of the spending over taxes, however you want to call it. The injections, the net contribution, however you want to say.
In your piece, Behind the Crisis in American Governance, Delusions about the Economy Treated as a Matter of Differing Economic Taste, you write about the tendency of the left to adopt the framing of the right, particularly in economic issues.
There's a number of different ways to go from that piece to look at different problems in economics. And it's really also about the epistemology of economics, or what is the status of economic knowledge and different assertions, and how do people also treat that? What is the folk economics part? In other words, what's the real economics part? And then what's folk meaning how people think about economics on the street? Everyone has their own folk economics from their life experience or their business experience or from their academic training, a pastiche of different things. MMT is a departure in that you have the distinction between the resource and financial resources, and you have an opening to reality and to empirical reality, which is closed in neoclassical economics and economic schools that are spun off from neoclassical economics. And the high priests, pundits, basically like Paul Krugman or Larry Summers, they tend to wrestle with this scholastic, reality-distant economic language and so forth and so on. They declare themselves to have a taste for a particular kind of economic view or another taste. And this encourages politicians to also think that they can just assert their own wishes and will, not really their own. Most of them are actors. They're paid representatives of the very wealthy in the United States. My understanding is also it's become that way in Great Britain as well.
You think?
And they are declaring something to be economic reality when it's a taste. And this is, to me, a delusion. Unfortunately, economics has not progressed enough to the point where people understand that there's a real part of the economy. You can insert and inject subjectivity into it. You can have ethics and you can have values that you can try to realize through economics, but there's also a real part of it. But in commentary in newspapers, it becomes sort of saying, oh, he's a sort of a liberal person, and here's a more of a hard-hearted person or a more realistic person who really is just about being cruel to ordinary people or something. And that's where the taste comes in. They just have a taste for sadism or for cruelty. And this other person has a taste for appearing to be Mother Bountiful or something. And it's really more what is their real instruments in government that affect the economy, and you do different things and they'll have different outcomes. Again, the subjectivity of government leaders is important, but it's at the same time, there's a reality that they can't deny.
And on this topic, you had another piece which was entitled Naomi Klein's Hard Money Ideas Undermine Her Laudable Climate Action Goals. We're talking about her because she has a big audience and a lot of influence. She's an excellent writer. It's quite hard to read somebody that's been quite influential and they're fighting the good fight, but they've got, as you write, her erroneous beliefs about money transmitted to tens of thousands are potentially catastrophic. To hold only hard money beliefs as climate activists is to almost certainly organize the defeat of rapid climate action. Can you expand on why that is?
It does actually go beyond the climate movement. There is a surfeit of hard money belief on the moderate or even the far left, even the Marxist left. In an environmental movement, there's also a particular fillip to that as well. It appears to me as though politicians like Bernie Sanders, and actually Bernie was advised by Stephanie Kelton, but nevertheless, he insists on a hard money pay for system for his proposals. In my perception, there is a kind of virtue signaling. We are the good people that are not about inventing money out of thin air for our wishes. We are about doing it, quote unquote, the right way with taxes for all of our spending proposals.
Making sure that we collect the already existing money that always did exist.
That's right.
And not add any of this fake,
tricky, insubstantial fake money, this paper money, this printed money, the money printing thing. So we remain virtuous with Naomi Klein. Now, I haven't checked in with her recently, but when she wrote that book, which is one of her main climate books.
The book we're talking about, by the way, is called This Changes Everything. I think the most recent thing I saw is the video out there on YouTube of her and I think Brian Eno and Stephanie and somebody else. It was a sort of bringing together of people from different disciplines. And I thought, oh, this will be great. And Stephanie stayed true to her MMT stuff. But I do recall Naomi still taking issue with it.
There's a couple things going on with her and that book, very similar with what Bernie Sanders is doing with taxation. It's a form of revenge or punishment, let's say, for bad actors. In this case, her idea was you're taking the money away from fossil fuel companies and putting it into climate-friendly projects. It's a certain type of reciprocity, I guess you'd call it negative reciprocity, where you're saying the bad people have all this money, we're going to take it away from the bad people and give it to the good people. And this is the same way that Bernie Sanders talks about, we're going to tax the rich people, we're going to tax the billionaires, and we're going to take their money and we're going to give it to the good things that you want. And so this morality play is something that is very attractive to Naomi Klein, but also many people in the climate movement. Marxists have a similar idea about money, that they don't think of government as some kind of independent money-creating entity. They think of the capitalists as possessing all the money.
I try to get myself in a sympathetic mindset because I think we can all remember a time when it probably took us quite a few attempts to internalize this idea about the government's deficit is the non-government sector's surplus. I always think it probably comes from the first time we can remember thinking about money was because it was given to us, i.e. it was pocket money or you stole it or you had to get it from somewhere. You've never been able to create money as an individual or as a household or anything like that. So by the time you're voting and thinking about politics and thinking about taxation, you're naturally thinking, oh yeah, they're taking my money off me and doing something with it.
It's called object constancy. It's something you learn as a child. I forget what exact age, 5, 6, 7. You learn that an object, if it's hidden, still exists. It's also reification. We're reifying objects and reifying money. And MMT works against our tendency to reify it, to make things out of it, to fetishize it. I think if you face it head on, you say, look, we've been taught to fetishize money as a thing, but it has existence only in certain cases. But in the case of the left or the climate movement, there are particular scenarios that they have in mind about we're going to take it away. I don't know if I sound I'm being cruel. I'm just describing what I think is the dynamic of the thinking. It's Robin Hood.
I think there's two sides to it, personally. I certainly think that the whole Robin Hood idea resonates with people. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so easily absorbed by so many. But you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn earlier, and very early into the first year or first 2 years of him becoming leader of the Labour Party, he actually had a policy called a People's QE. The name was not right. It was this notion of, if we're doing QE, we're creating money for the banks, then why are we not creating money for public purpose? And on that front, that was a very disruptive narrative because it challenged what had come before that, which was this idea of money is scarce. There's no money for anything. We need austerity. And it got people thinking. And for a long time, it was a main talking point for journalists to challenge any Jeremy Corbyn supporter on TV. And I didn't mind that because I thought the more they talk about it, the more they'll normalize it. And initially they'll call us crazy, but then slowly people will just come to accept it. But then later on, I don't know what happened internally. Richard Murphy left and there was this change in Jeremy Corbyn's policy. And suddenly the drive was all towards credibility and we need to sound more credible. And that meant abandoning the people's QE idea and adopting the responsible finances narrative that we see now. So then Jeremy Corbyn just accepted that change in strategy and spoke again. Bernie Sanders might have. So it was interesting to me to see what happened because Jeremy Corbyn seemed quite receptive to changing, but it was the people around him who perceived that to be too much of a liability.
I think what MMT evokes is a fear of boundless appetite. People are afraid of a boundlessness in appetite. If you can create money out of thin air, that means your, his, someone's appetites can be satisfied boundlessly. And that creates anxiety because people are afraid of either someone else being super greedy, their own greed, whatever it is. And this particularly applies to the left and also the environmental movement. So the left is anti-greed in general. A good left is supposed to support the appetites of ordinary people that have not been satisfied by the existing economic system. They should be the advocates for that, but at the same time, they're critics of wanton, greed-driven economic system. It's walking on a ridge between two different difficult situations. And you add the climate movement, we as people in the metropolitan centers of the world have been consuming in way more of the resources of the world than we should. So the idea of this instance in society that can create all these signifiers, this money, evokes all kinds of fears and concerns. The left or the climate movement has generally stood as critics of that kind of wishfulness.
Because we want to be helpful to activists and climate activists, let's get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty. So there's this erroneous belief about money, which is it somehow always existed in the world. Maybe lay out the truthful narrative and then compare that with the hard money narrative that gets it wrong and why it's important to get it right.
Okay, the erroneous conventional narrative is that money is this finite set of things that need to be conserved and you need to keep track of it as this finite set. And if government, if it spends it, it needs to find it again in the private sector or borrow it from other sovereigns or whatever, but it needs to find that money to stock its supply of these money things. And as I say it's obviously ridiculous, but that's the narrative that's being told. And then the truthful one is that money is created by the government. The government adds to the amount of money in circulation by deficit spending or net contribution of liquidity to the economy. And it adjusts that liquidity based on decisions that are made that have something to do with the real economy and also with the power dynamic around the government, economic orthodoxies that grip the politicians in different forms or other. And so the government is adjusting the liquidity level of the economy all the time. And in terms of the specific use of that money, the government can also direct that liquidity towards certain projects and aims. So it can be a vector, so to speak. It's not just a quantity. It is directed by fiscal policy. And then banks continue their operations of creating money for various projects by corporations to fund their operations to sell goods and services or to buy assets. And those operations over the span of the economic cycle are deflationary.
I think the most succinct way to say it is if we're going to turn money into a thing, and I think it's okay to do that, then say it's a tax credit. A £5 note is a promise to pay off £5 of your tax bill. And then because of that, it does all the other things that we think money does. It's a store of value, it's easily divisible and all of that stuff. And then obviously the thing that clears your payment to the government when you pay taxes is a transfer of reserves on your behalf by your bank, so that the reserves or central bank money is at the top of the pyramid, top of the hierarchy of money. And then below that, you've got bank credit. And there's two ways it can get into the system. It can get into the system because the government spent it into existence by adding reserves into the reserve system, or a private sector person went into debt and borrowed it into existence from the government through its agent. If you think of commercial banks as government agents, which Warren Mosler has said, I think that's an easy way to cut through the confusion.
In the Naomi Klein piece, you write that the whaling industry in the United States was not curtailed by anti-whaling activists throwing themselves in front of whaling ships, but by the discovery of oil and the use of fossil fuels instead of whale oil for light. Anti-fossil fuel infrastructure activism, like against the Keystone XL pipeline, is a good rallying point, but it must be paired with an achievable exit strategy from fossil fuel dependence. So I agree with a lot of that, but what would you say is your exit strategy? What are the things that we need to focus on?
Yes, the exit strategy is super important. I'm for what they call supply side activism, where you're trying to block the supply or block certain projects from being built, which is important and that needs to happen. But it needs, as a companion, an exit strategy. You need to have a vision of what you are going to do or what your representatives are going to do to make this fossil fuel project redundant, to make it non-worth it. And one of the things to do is to electrify transportation, also to right-size it. You don't need a large vehicle to go a mile to get milk or something like that. In other words, the Green New Deal should be on their banners as well. There needs to be a demand-side strategy in the sense of we're going to change our demand for energy.
I am hopelessly naive on this topic. Can I just jump in and ask, if we electrify modes of transportation, does it pollute less? Because to me, the electricity is still being supplied in large part by burning coal.
If you are in a purely coal-burning grid, if there's only coal on the grid where you are, it is not as good for the environment as oil. But the idea is that it's a combined strategy of electricity. You have no chance of greening a internal combustion engine, but you can green a electric mobility device like an electric bike or electric car and so on and so on, because you can change the input of electricity, the kind of electricity that you put into it.
Would you say electrifying the vehicles that we use to get from A to B or further, if just leaving it there is still only doing half the job? I'm asking this because I think we need to know what to want in order to have this demand side strategy that you're advocating.
Yes, you need to set a goal of whatever it is, 80% renewable energy on your local grid by 2032 or something like that. And then ban the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles and motorbikes, and have the government electrify the public transportation. In the case of Britain, offshore wind is probably some of the best option for generating non-carbon electricity in Great Britain because of the abundance of sea around you and the fact that wind offshore is more constant and stronger.
For me, I think a negotiating tactic is always shoot for Pluto. Hopefully you end up on the moon. So I would be like, okay, let's switch to renewables by the end of the year, knowing that the counterparty is going to come in and say, no, we can't do it by the end of the year, but we can do it by the end of 3 years' time or something like that. Because that 2030 just seems like way off. And then once you get there, some well-meaning person will have thrown another spanner in the works. But I was just wondering, is it realistic that it could be done in a matter of, I'm probably being very naive about this and I haven't read enough, but could it be done in a matter of 3 or 4 years?
So this is where declaring an emergency, a climate emergency, is one of the key features of what I propose. I think the climate emergency needs to be about a 10-year thing. And in that period of time, people are going to be experimenting with different ways to live that are non-polluting, that are non-greenhouse gas emitting. It should be a very democratic process. I can't imagine the Tories organizing such a thing, though the Tories are still to the left of the Republican Party in the United States. But anyway.
Is there anybody that's not to the left of the Republicans right now?
So in 2019, apparently the UK government declared a climate emergency. Not that anything happened afterwards.
Then it has to be fleshed out. What do you mean by a climate emergency? Let's say not just declaring the emergency, but then proposing things like remote work for 4 days a week.
I was going to say, I think we have a real chance of getting that off the ground or getting people to think about that realistically because of the pandemic.
Right.
People saw that it was actually possible. A little bit like after World War II, I think this is Tony Benn's take that after World War II, people saw the power of government spending and government mobilization that, if we can have full employment while we're planning to kill each other, why can't we have full employment while we're planning to heal each other? Why can't we have an NHS? And similarly, I think the pandemic's presented that potential upside with people seeing, look, we don't have to just fill up every highway with a car, with a negative externality creating machine.
To go back a little bit, I had a question with regards to the strategy of climate activists. And you mentioned the role of activists to sit in opposition to certain projects, particularly oil projects, is important. But that resonated with me because here we've had activists also take a stance of sometimes they, for example, block roads to make a point. And sometimes the public gets on the wrong side of that. And obviously we completely empathize with what they're trying to achieve. But it brings me back to some quote from a union leader a while back. Bill Mitchell has in his Green New Deal talk, he always mentions how this union leader was warning climate activists in the 1990s that you can't just say, let's get rid of the oil industry. You have to offer alternatives for employment. Otherwise, you'll force the oil workers to sit in opposition to you.
Right.
And I was wondering, maybe unions have been dealing with this for a lot longer than climate activists have, and maybe there's a lot to learn from unions. Would you say that as well? Should there be more cooperation between those two groups?
I think that, yes, climate activists, they're concerned enough to get out and do something about the climate crisis, and that's great, and I applaud that and I support it. But I think that there is, unfortunately, some activism that doesn't seem to take into account an understanding of economics and also understanding of the actual physical acts of what climate action actually is. Some of it is unromantic. It's not like even being la pasionaria in whatever in the Spanish Civil War, where you're on the front lines of a battle. It's insulating Britain actually. That's a pretty good way. It's literally going to some home and putting more insulation in the home. Yeah. It's not something that captures the imagination of many students, but it's actually climate action in some way or another and electrifying that home.
I think that is a great example though, because people can go, okay, here's what we're saying to do. The problem you used in your metaphor earlier about anti-whaling activists throwing themselves in front of whaling ships is that we need to create that off-ramp. And so all the insulate Britain activism is going, okay, this is a way to reduce our consumption where we actually get to do something positive rather than oppose something. And we talked about, okay, we need to switch to electric as much as possible, but then we need to go further up the energy supply story and make sure that what's supplying that electricity is not fossil fuels. When you start talking about this, a person will come into the chat, online and say, you have to embrace nuclear. There is no other way. It's cleaner than coal, except when something goes wrong. And I wonder what your thoughts on that were.
I'm not someone who is particularly anti-nuclear. I have considered in the past some nuclear as being necessary, and I'm not against research into nuclear, but it takes such a long time to build a nuclear power plant that if you're talking about an emergency program, and literally we don't have much time at all in terms of the climate crisis.
How long does it take to build a nuclear power plant?
12 years, 14 years, something like that. And there are people who make a calculation saying it's not as clean. You have to deal with the waste. And so I'm not against it in principle. My first published writing was about the German Greens in the 1980s. I lived in Germany for about 3 years. And there was an anti-nuclear movement was very strong in the 70s and 80s in Germany. And they're still actually dealing with the after effects of that. And the Green Party developed out of that movement, but it was jousting at the wrong windmill. And that France went over to nuclear power in the 60s and 70s has reduced the per capita emissions of each individual French citizen a lot. But that was a long-term project and it happened in the past. So I'm not jousting at nuclear. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I think it's the people who are nuclear advocates tend to be anti-renewable energy. They tend to have certain myths about renewable energy. To do renewable energy correctly, we need to have a super grid. There needs to be a continental super grid because the energy is not always flowing. The wind isn't always blowing and the sun goes up and down. And in the wintertime, the sun is a lot scarcer. So there needs to be various efforts to distribute the energy, which includes a super grid, which is a regional grid that extends across the water to Scandinavia, to France, and so forth and so on. And in the United States, we need a super grid as well that will balance the flow of energy. Now, that will take a while to build, but it could be built potentially in 3 or 4 years using high voltage, direct current, electrical towers and so forth and so on. But that would require, talking about government actions, no company has the incentive to do that. And that planning is something that, because of anti-communism, among other things, it's become a taboo when we need planning with regard to energy. And executing that plan is the emergency situation. So it's not just wishing and hoping for the market to supply the goods and services that we need.
How could you be facing a problem of the scale that we're talking about, which is this existential crisis, climate catastrophe, and shy away from planning? It's going to take a plan.
Yes,
Do you know what
absolutely.
I mean? It's just irrational to think, well, let's just create some incentives and let the chips fall where they may.
The thing that really makes me uneasy about nuclear is that nuclear is often cited as being a very safe type of technology, and the metric that they'll use to suggest that is the deaths per kilowatt hour generated. The problem I have with that is that it doesn't really capture the potential risks, and human beings in general are not very good at assessing potential risks. We tend to learn from errors and mistakes, and if we look back, for example, at Chernobyl, nuclear plants were designed very differently back then, and Chernobyl exposed a certain scientists, as far as I know, they didn't realize that nuclear plants could explode in the way that happened.
Yeah, I lived in Germany when Chernobyl was.
Oh, gosh.
I'm not ancient, yes.
And as far as I know, that event was really a few inches from being 1,000 times worse than what it actually was. And so, because we tend to learn from mistakes and errors like that, next time we may not be as lucky. And it only really takes one event, one catastrophic event, for the deaths per kilowatt hour figure to go shooting up above anything else. And apart from obviously the potential deaths, how much of the space around in Chernobyl is now kind of uninhabitable, effectively? It's quite a large area.
I'm not sure, but yes, it's still a protected zone. And just in terms of security, I mean, look at the Russian army going in and capturing nuclear plants as part of their strategy to control Ukraine. They become choke points. Now, this can be the case for the supergrid I'm talking about. If you had a supergrid would involve 800 kV or whatever high voltage lines that could also be captured by some kind of army. So there's the ideal picture of the totally distributed renewable energy where every home has its own solar collectors and its storage battery and is independent of the grid. And I think that could be possible with very efficient homes in certain latitudes. It's hard to imagine that in Scotland, the strength of the sun in Scotland in the winter. But they do have wind, but that would require a feed to their home.
I think they're a net energy exporter, so they are covered, I think.
The other issue is nobody likes wind farms for some reason. People don't like, it's a not in my backyard type of attitude.
There's NIMBYism, yes. In general, people have been pretty spoiled. Even people of modest means are taught to, in our society, to emulate people who are picky and choosy about their aesthetics and so forth and so on. But yes, obviously it gets worse the higher up the income chain or the socioeconomic ladder you go. But there's also been organized campaigns by right-wing. Britain has been, and the United States has been shot through with all kinds of malicious right-wing campaigns of various kinds that have created the appearance, certainly astroturfed various kinds of resistance to certain things. And so that the perception of it being unpopular, I know Donald Trump didn't like wind because of his golf course in Scotland and he was complaining about it. But I don't care about his opinion. And he's a climate denier now. He wasn't at one time, but now he is. So I think there are certain modest changes that people need to accept to go with renewable energy. And some of them are very positive. There's certain pollution, especially in a city like London, which gets polluted, smoggy sometimes. There are positive externalities that people will enjoy, as well as some of the slight inconveniences. But
So just bringing the MMT back into it, the way I've been thinking about it lately is that we know that for a currency issuing government, money is not scarce. Governments that issue their own currency, I know it sounds like a tautology, but they create new money when they spend, and it doesn't come from anywhere if you're the issuer. And so really what governments in that position are doing when they spend is they're spending resources. Resources are finite to a currency issuing government. So in which case, what needs to be done is a sort of comprehensive stock take of what the resources are that are at the fingertips of the state, and then a conversation about what's the sustainable way and the fair and equitable way to distribute them. And we were talking to Stephen Williams, who edited and wrote for a volume about MMT and ecological economics that came out earlier this year. And he was saying that there was an effort that was started in the 2000s, a sort of an accounting of resources for the UK, but it was shelved because when the Conservative Lib Dem coalition came in 2010, or later on in that particular parliament, they just said, we've run out of money, so we can't do this thing anymore. And so it was shelved. But then I was interested to see that you had proposed in 2013 that macroeconomists, and in particular MMT economists, should develop a macroeconomic accounting methodology for use by political parties and governments as a replacement for business accounting methods. Could you tell us about that methodology?
It's similar to what you were just suggesting was recommended or started in Britain, except it would encompass not just environmental or ecological or climate-related resources. I think macroeconomic accounting is the logical corollary or logical extension of modern money theory. So even though it wouldn't necessarily be entirely MMT specific, instead of a series of critiques of, let's say, a government official that misguidedly says we need to balance the budget, or an economist that says government should be balancing its budget, it creates a stable proposal by, it should be really all macroeconomists, but certainly MMT economists and some other related economists, to say, why do government policy in a way that disregards the real resources of the economy and the actual welfare? Essentially, it's an extension of also welfare economics, in the sense that you want to not just the physical resources, but also the human resources of the economy, which is also real resources. They're not financial resources. They're not taxes collected. It's what is the substrate of action by the government. And then literally you politicians, this is the source of mostly the positive or negative opinion that the voters have of you, in the next election, how much you can change for the better those real circumstances. I don't know if the UK Parliament does this sort of what we call CBO accounting in the United States, Congressional Budget Office accounting, which is this business accounting, which is what MMT is critiquing all the time and saying is wrong. Anyway, it's an instance in the government, in the Congress, that basically says either this is going to add to the deficit or not. Basically, that's the grade it gives. And so it's just using business accounting, and it's cheap and easy in a way. It probably requires 2 economists. And to do macroeconomic accounting would require 15 economists and also related scientists and social scientists and natural scientists to create a model of the economy, the model of the real resources in the economy, and the model of what government could do in terms of spending or regulation to intervene in that. To me, it's just the sensible, scientific / political / realistic way to operationalize what MMT economists are talking about. And again, it doesn't have to be restricted to an MMT view of how the government funds itself. It's an extension of what macroeconomists have been dealing with for the last 80, 90 years. It just would be a way to create a multi-factor evaluation of any given piece of legislation. You wouldn't have to redo this model every time a piece of legislation is created or a proposal is created. It would simply be, you do some inputs, whatever, from this existing proposal, and you decide, does this promote welfare? Does it reduce carbon emissions? So you have a multifactorial, it's not a simple Boolean yes, no kind of thing. When I talk about it now and I think about the level of commitment of some of at least the U.S. legislators to the role of public servant, and I think it's of it as being pie in the sky, but I think it needs to come from the macroeconomics community and the MMT community. An organized proposal for let's replace CBO accounting because it's always going to mislead, and it's simply a hurdle to creating good government policy. And good being, does it promote social welfare? Does it reduce carbon emissions?
An intermediate step for, say, the CBO in the States would be, instead of scoring things on whether it adds to or takes away from the deficit, you'd score things on whether they add to inflationary pressures or not, and whether those inflationary pressures can be ameliorated.
Sure. Supposedly, that's what the deficit is supposed to add to, but that would be a step along the way. That's a good idea, yes.
And so running through the way to plan out this accounting methodology, step 1 would be, I'm just reading from your piece on this, survey and prioritization of macroethical commitments, which I think that hasn't been done yet, has it really, in many of our economies, as far as I know? So it requires a commitment. The thing is that we have a dispute in our politics in the United States, and I think to some degree in Britain as well, about whether government is even a legitimate part of the society. And there are people in the right wing in the United States who think government is totally the bad thing. So the thing we got to do is get out of people's way. That's been the ideology since at least Reagan in different forms. So it would require a political party or a group, or at least a set of bureaucrats, deciding that government is actually integral to things like social welfare. Certainly, your proposal of just calculating what is the inflationary pressure that is likely to come from this piece of spending or whatever, that would probably be more acceptable to some of these people who think of government as being optional. It's literally, we have an option to have a government rather than we have to have a government. Yeah. I often say, even your libertarians are like, you need something to enforce your property rights. Which institution is going to be that? A volunteer institution or something? To me, that's where the libertarian visions of the future fall apart.
It's really barmy, to use a British. It's really barmy when you think about it, but it goes back to the idea of economics being a matter of taste. They think their taste is such that they can deny reality because of their own personal taste. It's very egocentric, very grandiose in a way. They're not looking at the reality that encompasses their lives and saying, hey, wait a minute, I really wouldn't be here if it weren't for all these actions by government. But they think of themselves, I'm floating above all this and I can decide, like this grand spirit in the sky, maybe I don't need this government thing.
So that comes first, and it's a big step, is the national conversation about what is the public good. I guess that's really what elections are for, or what they're notionally for. Parties lay out their vision of what the next few years are going to look like and see who agrees with it. Once you've got that in place, then you've got the inventory of real and financial conditions, which we've just been over. Then we prioritizing what's the most urgent, which things should best be sorted out by the private sector and which need to be sorted out by government. And I think a lot of these things that we talk about, building a grid for renewable energy, these things are natural monopolies, right? To me, there's no way around it. You've got a problem that's the scale that it is. And the only organizations that can move the kind of resources that need moving are governments. Now, they might piece off some of the project work to private companies, but it seems to me government really needs to get in the driving seat.
Yeah, it's a matter of survival and protection of people. And the thing is that in a crisis, people complain that, oh, look, Russia's shooting missiles at us. We need you, UK government, to install more anti-missile batteries or whatever it is. So in a crisis, in a foxhole, everybody is a believer. We're talking about good governance, good government, good public policy, which encompasses all these things. And in this case, this great emergency that we're facing and the cutting off of Russian gas supplies and oil supplies, or the idea that one should become independent of those things based on this development. There is a step along the way, I think, to really seriously embracing that, which is what I would call a Polanyian step of seeing the economy as embedded and the politics as all being embedded in society. That's an embedded totality. And it's not something you optionally can sort through and decide, well, I don't really like government, so I'll just section off the government part and I'll just create this intellectual object called the market that's self-regulating, and you don't need any government spending to make it happen. It's all self-sustaining. It's Polanyian, I think, to really get into doing good public policy that's also informed by science through macroeconomic accounting. I think that requires a fundamental discussion about, look, government is not something that's optional. If it's bad government, we need to make it better by electing the right people, by protesting and so forth and so on. And we need it now to do things for us in rapid succession and in a hurry based on science, based on the reality.
So it seems to me we need to very quickly decide what's going to further the public good. And we need to have this accounting in real resource terms of resources that can be deployed by government in order to fight the climate crisis and build this off-ramp for the fossil fuel industry and the people who are dependent on the fossil fuel industry, which is lots of us. In terms of our livelihoods, maybe we don't all work for an oil company, but the fossil fuel economy is a very key part of our existence. And these things need to be done in a hurry. Electrifying transport, electrifying everything that we can, and making sure that that electricity is being generated by renewable sources. For somebody listening and thinking this is very big, what would be a step that they could take? Maybe where could they go and just connect with other people online who are working away at the same problem or the same nexus of problems?
I think the idea of Insulate Britain, it's a very good idea. I don't know what their local activist meetups are like, but I think it's a way to concretize a portion of what needs to happen, but also get involved in, I assume it would be Labour, it would be the party still that people would be, in Britain at least, would be trying to persuade not to be so dumb.
I wouldn't be so sure of that, but yeah.
I know their current leadership is not anything I would be interested in myself personally, but I guess MMT has become a global interest. So find people who are interested in MMT, but also people who are doing activism and pushing on the side of the political spectrum that is focusing on, for instance, a Green New Deal of some kind, which is at least on the climate side of things. If you don't have one in your country, you should be focusing on it. In Eastern Europe, you want to become independent of Russian oil and Russian gas. It's like you got to do a Green New Deal. It's not easy, but whatever your independence and your democratic strivings are, you should be getting independent of fossil fuels. Listen to other episodes and also other MMT resources that we've been discussing and that are being pointed to, and formulate your own, start your own movement, because there are not many people who are focusing on these issues, even though It shouldn't be such an exclusive club. It's being able to keep a paradoxical mindset in your mind between conserving parts of the global commons that are being ravaged and being depleted, at the same time accelerating through fiscal policy the action that people take to change the way we do things, to change the material and energy flows in economies, which requires lots of work that needs to be remunerated and action needs to be taken. And some of which some people already have the skills to do some of these things, and they can do them with sufficient and correct government policy that would direct them and reward them for doing that. So it's a complex combination of different ideas, but there are certain specific actions that can be taken. Doing bike activism, even if you can, if it's available to you, getting more out on your bike, even though in some places it's easier than others in terms of weather, in terms of the way cars treat you. It's not just an intellectual thing, it's an actual active thing. Try to buy stuff that doesn't stick around for eons in the landfill, that kind of thing.
I think that's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking with Dr. Michael Hoexter, policy analyst and consultant on green building, climate and renewable energy, and research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. We'll link to where you can find his work in the show notes. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Michael Hoexter.
Thank you so much, Christian. Appreciate it.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.